The CNN studio lights blazed as Jeff Bezos sat behind the panel desk, his confident smirk spreading across his face like a man who had everything figured out. The tech magnate and Amazon founder adjusted his sleek, minimalist glasses and straightened his tailored suit, clearly relishing what he expected to be another routine victory. He had just finished tearing apart the latest social and economic policies aimed at regulating tech companies with the calculated precision that had made him a billionaire. The studio buzzed with the usual pre-segment energy. Makeup artists made final touch-ups. Camera operators adjusted their angles, and producers whispered last-minute instructions through earpieces. But there was something different in the air tonight, a tension that suggested this wasn't going to be just another typical discussion. When the moderator announced, "Joining us now is actor and activist Jonathan Roumie," Bezos's eyes lit up like a shark spotting an easy meal. He leaned back in his chair with the confidence of someone who's dominated every industry he's entered for years. This was going to be fun. What happened in the next 25 minutes would leave the audience in the media world stunned. It would turn Jeff Bezos, the face of Silicon Valley's unchecked power, into a viral meme of humiliation and launch Jonathan Roumie into the national spotlight as one of the most formidable new voices for real change. Because Roumie didn't come to just talk policy, he came armed with a story so powerful, so personal, and so authentic that it would expose everything wrong with the unchecked capitalism Bezos personified and remind America what real leadership rooted in empathy and humanity looks like. This wasn't going to be another forgettable cable news segment that disappeared into the news cycle. This was about to become a masterclass in how lived experience trumps corporate wealth, how authenticity destroys corporate manipulation, and how the most powerful weapon in politics is simply telling the truth about your own life. Before we dive into this epic confrontation, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss a single moment of how an actor, known for his advocacy for the working class, just schooled one of the richest men in the world. Trust me, what you're about to witness will have you questioning everything you thought you knew about the power of wealth and influence. The moment Jonathan Roumie appeared on screen via satellite from his community office, Bezos leaned forward like a predator smelling blood. His calm demeanor masked a belief that he could easily dismantle his opponent. Roumie, however, was a different breed. His humble yet confident appearance, with his natural, unpolished look, carried the authenticity that Bezos could only dream of. Wearing a simple, well-fitted blazer, Roumie looked directly into the camera with the confidence of someone who had seen the injustices of the system firsthand and had made it his mission to fight back. Behind Roumie, the backdrop of his office, adorned with the community awards and photos of his work with underprivileged groups, contrasted sharply with Bezos's pristine corporate setup. Roumie's setting was personal, intentional, and spoke volumes about his values, something Bezos, surrounded by the trappings of corporate power and vast wealth, could never replicate. Well, here comes another actor to lecture us on real-world problems, Bezos muttered, just loud enough for the microphones to catch. His words dripped with the kind of casual dismissiveness that had come to define his public persona, suggesting that anyone who challenged the status quo of corporate dominance was just playing identity politics instead of addressing the real issues. The other panelists shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension. Even Jake Tapper, a veteran of many contentious interviews, raised his eyebrows, sensing that this segment would be far from ordinary. But Roumie just smiled, a smile that carried the weight of someone who had been underestimated his entire life and had learned to use that underestimation as a weapon. To understand what was about to unfold, it's essential to know exactly who these two figures were and why this confrontation was inevitable. Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, had built an empire by controlling the flow of goods and services to millions. With a net worth that regularly topped hundreds of billions, he had spent years perfecting his image as a benevolent tech mogul, pushing the narrative that his company, and by extension, himself, were the future. He had appeared countless times in media, championing free market capitalism and the growth of tech. For Bezos, this CNN appearance was supposed to be routine, attack progressive policies, defend the corporate elite, and walk away with his image unscathed. He'd done it thousands of times before across every major network, expertly spinning narratives that aligned with his interests and those of other billionaires. He knew how to dismiss progressive activists and make their concerns seem trivial. His formula was simple: question the credentials of those who challenge the corporate world and remind everyone of his vast wealth and experience. It had worked against everyone from politicians to celebrities who dared to speak out about the destructive impact of corporate greed. There was no reason to think this time would be any different. But Jonathan Roumie, an actor turned outspoken advocate for social justice in the working class, wasn't going to play by Bezos's rules. Roumie had used his platform to challenge inequality and corporate greed for years. He didn't come from corporate circles. He came from the streets and the struggles of everyday people, working class families, communities impacted by inequality, and those left behind by the capitalist system Bezos represented. His research team had prepared the usual opposition research, his past comments, any criticisms, anything they could use to paint Jonathan Roumie as out of touch with the working class. But what they hadn't prepared him for was someone who would turn his own weapons against him with surgical precision. But Jonathan Roumie wasn't just any actor. At 43, the former community activist and outspoken advocate for the underprivileged had already made waves in his short career. But not in the usual way most newcomers gain attention. While others focused on climbing the media ladder or courting wealthy donors, Roumie had immediately started calling out corporate hypocrisy wherever he found it. And he had a particular talent for finding it in places others were afraid to look. Roumie had grown up in a working-class neighborhood, watching families struggle while corporations flourished. He'd worked multiple jobs, including at local shelters, learning early that the law and wealth could be tools for either empowerment or oppression, depending on who controlled them. His transition from Hollywood to political commentary had been unexpected, but it was driven by a deep commitment to the issues that affected the everyday lives of working families. His advocacy for economic justice, social equality, and workers' rights quickly gained traction on social media, where his videos breaking down complex social issues went viral because he had a gift for explaining how corporate greed affected real people's lives. He wasn't afraid to challenge anyone, whether politicians, billionaires like Jeff Bezos, or other media figures, if they were putting profit over principles. What made him dangerous to establishment figures like Bezos wasn't just his intelligence or his communication skills. It was his complete lack of deference to the traditional power structures that dominated Washington and Silicon Valley. Roumie hadn't come to the media circuit to make friends or seek approval. He'd come to fight for the people who'd sent him to the front lines, and he didn't care whose feelings got hurt in the process. More importantly, Roumie had something Bezos didn't expect: a perfect memory for details and a deep understanding of the working class's struggle. The stakes of this confrontation went far beyond just another televised debate. This was about the future of American politics. Would the corporate elites and their unchecked power continue to dominate the conversation? Or was a new generation of authentic voices about to break through? Bezos represented everything that was broken about the tech-driven, corporate-controlled economy: exploitation of workers, profit-driven policies, and the belief that the ordinary person had no voice. Roumie represented the possibility of something different: politics based on real experiences, honest conversations, and genuinely fighting for working families. As the cameras rolled and the segment began, neither of them knew that this conversation would be shared millions of times, spawning dozens of reaction videos and fundamentally shifting how people viewed both of their careers. The CNN moderator, Jake Tapper, tried to maintain control. We're discussing the latest jobs report and what it means for American families. Mr. Roumie, your response to Mr. Bezos' analysis? Bezos had just spent 3 minutes explaining why the job numbers were misleading and how corporate-friendly policies were the key to prosperity. His tone was condescending, his facts selective, and his conclusion predetermined. Everything was fine, and it was all the government's fault. It was classic Jeff Bezos, confident, dismissive, and designed to make his opponent look foolish for disagreeing with the obvious conclusion. But as Roumie began to respond, something in his voice made everyone in the studio sit up a little straighter. There was a quality to his tone that suggested he wasn't just another actor delivering talking points. This was someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment, this opportunity, this platform to say something that had been building inside him for years. The camera operators, sensing the change in energy, instinctively adjusted their shots. The other panelists, who had been checking their phones and half listening to the usual back and forth, suddenly gave him their full attention. Even the production assistants in the control room stopped their chatter and turned toward the monitors. Something big was about to happen. Everyone could feel it. Mr. Bezos, Roumie began, his voice steady but laced with an edge that suggested he wasn't here to play games. I find it interesting that you want to talk about fake numbers when your entire career was built on selling fake convenience and treating workers like replaceable commodities. The studio went dead silent, the kind of silence that occurs when everyone realizes they're witnessing something historic unfold in real time. You could practically hear the producers in the control room scrambling to figure out how to handle what was clearly about to become must-see television. This wasn't the usual polite political disagreement. This was personal, direct, and dangerous. In newsrooms across the country, assignment editors who had been half watching while juggling other stories suddenly stopped what they were doing and turned their full attention to the screen. Social media managers at major outlets began preparing to clip and distribute what was about to happen. Political reporters started typing preliminary tweets, sensing that this segment was about to generate significant buzz. The other panelists, once comfortable in their scripted roles, now looked like deer caught in headlights, aware that they were no longer participants in this conversation, but witnesses to a confrontation that was spiraling far beyond the usual cable news discourse. Bezos's confident smirk faltered for just a moment before returning, albeit less certain. Well, Mr. Roumie, I think you're a little out of your depth here. We're talking about economics, not relitigating business practices you probably didn't even understand when you were building your empire. The condescension dripped from every word like poison from a snake's fangs. This was Jeff Bezos' standard playbook, refined over decades of building Amazon, exploiting workers, and expanding his billion-dollar empire. Remind everyone that he was the experienced, successful business mogul, while treating his opponent, Jonathan Roumie, like a naive actor who didn't understand the nuances of the real world. The technique had been devastatingly effective against countless critics who had tried to match his wealth and influence, rather than challenge the very system he had built. But as Bezos delivered what should have been a knockout punch, something strange happened. Instead of getting defensive or angry, instead of falling into the trap that had ensnared so many before him, Roumie did something unexpected. He smiled. Not the practiced, political smile that television audiences were used to seeing, the kind that said, "I'm being polite while my team figures out how to respond to this attack." No, this was different. This was the smile of someone who had just watched his opponent make exactly the mistake he had been hoping for. This was the smile of a man who understood the stakes and was ready to expose the man across from him. It was the kind of smile that should have made Bezos very, very nervous. But Bezos, comfortable in his wealth and surrounded by the trappings of corporate media, missed the warning signs entirely. He was so focused on delivering his rehearsed attack lines that he failed to notice he was walking into a trap that had been carefully set by someone who understood exactly how men like him operated. "Oh, I was paying attention," Roumie said, leaning forward slightly. "I was paying attention when you built your fortune by treating workers like disposable assets. I was paying attention when you cut corners, avoiding taxes, and undermined workers' rights, all in the name of profit." The studio went dead silent. The kind of silence that occurs when everyone suddenly realizes they're witnessing something historic unfold in real time. You could practically hear the producers in the control room scrambling to figure out how to handle what was clearly about to become must-see television. This wasn't the usual polite corporate debate. This was personal, direct, and dangerous. In newsrooms across the country, assignment editors who had been half watching while juggling other stories suddenly stopped what they were doing and turned their full attention to the screen. Social media managers at major outlets began preparing to clip and distribute what was about to happen. Political reporters started typing preliminary tweets, sensing that this segment was about to generate significant buzz. The other panelists, once confident and at ease, now looked like deer caught in headlights. They were no longer participants in the conversation. They were witnesses to a confrontation that was spiraling beyond the usual bounds of corporate-friendly TV. Bezos's confident smirk faltered for just a moment before he tried to recover, his voice losing some of its usual sharpness. "Well, Mr. Roumie, I think you're a little out of your depth here." A viral moment that would be dissected by political analysts, shared millions of times across social media, and studied in communications classes for years to come. The tension in the studio was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Camera operators zoomed in instinctively, recognizing they were capturing something truly special. The lighting seemed more dramatic, the colors more vivid, as if the universe itself was conspiring to make this moment as cinematic as possible. Bezos, still unaware of how badly he had miscalculated, pressed forward with his attack. In his mind, he was simply doing what he'd always done, using his superior wealth and insider knowledge to dismiss another opponent. He had no idea that he was about to become the main character in his own destruction. What happened next would be replayed millions of times across social media and turn Jonathan Roumie into a household name, while Bezos would become the punchline of a joke he'd never see coming. Clearly rattled but trying to regain his footing, Bezos made the fatal mistake of doubling down. "Mr. Roumie, basically, me," he began with that typical corporate arrogance. "With all due respect to your opinions, you're just an actor. You've never been in the trenches of real business decisions. You've been playing roles, not solving real-world problems like I have for decades." It was the kind of dismissive put-down that had worked for Bezos hundreds of times before. Remind everyone of the experience gap, question the opponent's credibility, and then move on to safer talking points. But this time, it backfired spectacularly. Roumie smiled, not the political smile you'd expect from a media figure. No, this was different. This was the kind of smile a prosecutor gets when a witness just stepped right into a trap they didn't see coming. "Mr. Bezos," Roumie began, leaning forward slightly, his voice steady, but with a sharp edge that suggested he wasn't here to play games. "Since you want to talk about experience and achievements, let me tell you a story. It's about a little boy who grew up in a neighborhood where the schools were underfunded, the streets dangerous, and most people didn't expect much from kids who looked like him. The camera operators, sensing something big was about to happen, instinctively adjusted their shots. The other panelists, who had been checking their phones and half listening, suddenly gave him their full attention. The energy in the room shifted completely. This little boy's father worked 2 jobs, one as a janitor at a school and another in a warehouse overnight. His mother worked long hours as a waitress, struggling to make ends meet because she didn't have the education or resources that people like you, Mr. Bezos, take for granted. Bezos shifted uncomfortably in his chair. This wasn't going where he expected. Roumie continued, his voice picking up intensity. "When I was 10 years old, my dad came home from work every night so tired he could barely keep his eyes open. He worked his fingers to the bone, but still had to rely on government assistance to get by. Programs that people like you, Mr. Bezos, call handouts, but were literally the only way families like mine survived." The studio was completely silent now. Even the camera operators seemed to be holding their breath. But you know what? That little boy didn't give up. He watched his parents fight for every bit of support they could get, for every scrap of opportunity. He watched them keep fighting, not because it was easy, but because that's what you do when you have no other choice. Roumie's voice began to build, carrying the passion of someone who had lived through this struggle. That little boy worked hard to get a scholarship and went to college. I worked night shifts. I did what I had to do to get through school. I became an actor, but I didn't forget where I came from. And then one day, I saw the way the system was built, how it works for people like you, Mr. Bezos, and I decided I couldn't stay silent anymore. I couldn't just keep playing roles. I had to speak out for the people who were still fighting every day just to survive. The silence in the studio was deafening now. Bezos looked at Roumie with wide eyes as if he was seeing him for the first time. Roumie continued, "And I didn't come here today to talk about acting. I came here to tell you something. You want to talk about real experience? Let's talk about the experiences of the people you've stepped on to get to where you are. You've built your empire on the backs of underpaid workers, exploiting them to increase your profits. And yet, you sit here lecturing people like me who have actually lived the lives that your policies harm. You've made billions while my community still struggles." The tension in the room had completely shifted. The studio was now focused entirely on Roumie. "You want to talk about what it means to serve? Let me tell you what service looks like. It looks like fighting for people who can't afford the basics while you're living in your mansion, shielding yourself from the very problems your company helped create. You want to lecture me on how to make the world better? Well, you might want to start by understanding how real people live." The other panelists exchanged glances, realizing that this moment wasn't about policy anymore. It was about authenticity, truth, and the power of speaking from lived experience. Bezos opened his mouth to respond, but Roumie wasn't done. "You want to talk about success, Mr. Bezos? Fine. Let's talk about my first year of advocacy. I've helped countless workers unionize. I've spoken out against wage inequality, and I've worked with community leaders to tackle the issues that really matter. I've used my platform to uplift those who have been silenced for too long. But you know what I've never done in my career? I've never sold my soul to corporations for profit. Roumie's gaze hardened as he leaned forward, looking directly into the camera as if addressing every viewer individually. I've lived the life of the people I represent. I know what it's like to struggle, to fight for every dollar, to see your family hurt by a system that doesn't care about them. I know what it's like to be underestimated, to be dismissed by people who think their wealth and power make them untouchable. But I'm here to tell you, Mr. Bezos, that we are the ones who are changing this system. You. That little boy from St. Louis is now a man who speaks out for those who have no voice. And he's not going to sit quietly while billionaires who've never struggled a day in their lives lecture him about serving the American people. The pause that followed felt like it lasted forever. Bezos sat there, clearly struggling to find a response that wouldn't make things worse for him. Finally, he managed to speak, but his voice lacked all the confidence and arrogance it had carried just minutes earlier. Well, I respect your family's struggles, Mr. Roumie, but I still think you're mischaracterizing my role in all this. I've built an empire, and my experience in business is unmatched. Roumie interrupted, and now his activist instincts took over completely. I've done my research, Mr. Bezos. I know exactly what your role was, Roumie said, leaning forward. I know about the labor practices Amazon's warehouse workers face, about how you fought to keep them underpaid while making billions. I know about the profits you make from exploiting low-income workers and small businesses while you sit in your ivory tower. The camera caught Bezos's face going pale as he realized this wasn't just an emotional appeal. Roumie had actual receipts. So here's my question for you, Mr. Bezos, Roumie continued, his voice steady. When you were collecting those profits, did you ever think about the workers who were suffering in those warehouses? Did you ever think about the families that can't make ends meet while you boast about your multi-billion-dollar wealth? Did you ever think about the children who are growing up in homes with nothing but empty promises from people like you? Bezos opened his mouth, but no words came out. For perhaps the first time in his career, the man who had shaped global commerce was completely speechless. Because that little boy from St. Louis, who had watched his family struggle, had grown up to become a man who would not be silenced by the likes of him. And now I'm in a position to make sure that when people like you want to exploit others, there's going to be someone in that room who remembers what it actually costs, Roumie added, his voice rising with purpose. The studio fell silent. Bezos slumped in his chair, his usual composure now completely shattered. Jake Tapper, the moderator, clearly struggling to figure out how to follow that, managed to stammer, "We'll be right back after this break." As the cameras cut away, viewers could see Bezos slumped in his chair, looking like a man who'd just been hit by a truck he never saw coming. What happened in the minutes, hours, and days following that CNN segment would fundamentally change how both Jeff Bezos and Jonathan Roumie were viewed by the American public. The first sign that something extraordinary had just occurred came during the commercial break itself. Social media exploded before the show even returned to air. Jonathan Roumie began trending within minutes, followed quickly by Bezos Destroyed and That Little Boy. The clip of Roumie's story, "Let Me Tell You About a Little Boy," was shared over 100,000 times on Twitter before the segment even ended. TikTok users began creating reaction videos, with many focusing on the moment when Bezos' smirk disappeared and he realized he was in serious trouble. When CNN returned from commercial, the dynamic in the studio had completely shifted. Bezos, who had begun the segment as the confident alpha dog, now looked like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. His usual rapid-fire talking points were gone, replaced by halting attempts to defend his record that only made him look worse. "I think there's been some misunderstanding about my role," he said weakly. But Jake Tapper wasn't going to let him off the hook. "Mr. Roumie made some very specific allegations about your business practices. Do you want to respond to those?" It was a fair question, but Bezos clearly hadn't expected to be put on the defensive. His usual strategy of attacking his opponents had backfired so spectacularly that now he was the one scrambling to justify his career. "Look, I've always disclosed my business relationships," he said, but even he seemed to know how weak that sounded. "And I think it's unfair to suggest that policy disagreements are somehow personal vendettas." Roumie, who had remained quiet during Bezos' stumbling response, leaned forward again. "Mr. Bezos, this isn't about policy disagreements. This is about accountability. You spent years exploiting workers, profiting from their pain, while you're lecturing people like me about how to run businesses. You sit on television every week, telling elected officials how to do their jobs, while collecting checks from the same corporate interests that benefit from the suffering of the very people I fight for. He paused, letting that sink in before delivering the final blow. The difference between us isn't experience, Mr. Bezos. It's that I actually represent the people who live with the consequences of our decisions. You represent the people who profit from them. The segment ended with Bezos looking defeated and Roumie looking like someone who had just introduced himself to the nation in the most powerful way possible. But the real impact was just beginning. Within hours, the full video had been uploaded to YouTube and was being shared across every social media platform. Political commentators from both parties began weighing in, with many acknowledging that they had witnessed something unprecedented. MSNBC's Rachel Maddow opened her show that night by calling it the most authentic moment in cable news politics in years. Even Fox News acknowledged that Roumie had landed some serious punches. Though they focused more on defending Bezos' overall legacy, the reaction from viewers was overwhelmingly positive for Roumie. Comments poured in from workers, veterans, and everyday Americans who said they finally felt like someone had spoken for them on national television. "This is what we need more of in politics," wrote one user. "Someone who actually knows what it's like to struggle." "I've never seen Jeff Bezos look so uncomfortable," wrote another. Roumie destroyed him with the truth. But perhaps the most telling reactions came from other politicians. Democratic lawmakers began sharing the clip with comments like, "This is leadership," and "Finally someone said it." Even some Republicans privately acknowledged that Bezos had badly underestimated his opponent. More importantly, the clip began to reshape how people viewed both figures. For Roumie, a once relatively unknown actor turned advocate, his social media following exploded by over 200,000 followers in just 48 hours. Speaking requests poured in from universities, advocacy groups, and media outlets. Jonathan Roumie was invited to appear on late-night talk shows and political podcasts. But more significantly, his story resonated with millions of Americans who saw their own experiences reflected in his narrative. The little boy from St. Louis became a symbol of possibility, the embodiment of what could happen when people from working-class backgrounds actually made it to positions of power. For Bezos, the impact was more complicated. While his core supporters defended him and argued that Roumie had been unfair, there was no denying that his carefully cultivated image as the ultimate tech mogul had taken a serious hit. Corporate-friendly publications began questioning whether Bezos was still the effective advocate for Silicon Valley interests that he had once been. His speaking fees reportedly decreased, and some organizations began looking for fresher faces to represent the tech elite's viewpoint. More importantly, the exchange highlighted everything that many Americans disliked about the corporate establishment. Here was a man who had made billions off tech monopolies, lecturing an advocate who had actually lived the struggles that most Americans faced. The story sparked broader conversations about representation in American politics in the tech world. Comment sections and social media discussions were filled with people asking why so many influential figures in politics and businesses were wealthy consultants rather than people who had actually lived the experiences they were discussing. How many Jeff Bezoses do we have giving opinions about policies that affect working families? One viral tweet asked. And how many Jonathan Roumies do we have actually making the decisions? The impact extended beyond just social media. Roumie's campaign fundraising skyrocketed, with small dollar donations pouring in from across the country. More importantly, other working-class candidates began citing him as inspiration for their own political ambitions. The exchange also had policy implications. Roumie's specific mention of workers' rights and his advocacy for fair wages brought new attention to these issues. Labor groups began reaching out to his office, and he was invited to join key committees focused on economic justice and labor reform. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was cultural. The exchange became a teaching moment about the difference between lived experience and corporate wealth. Roumie had demonstrated that authenticity and personal stakes could be more powerful than traditional business credentials. Young people in particular responded to his message. College campuses began inviting him to speak, and many students said his story inspired them to consider public service careers. "You don't have to come from wealth or connections to make a difference," said one college student whose video reaction went viral. "You just have to have something real to fight for." The exchange also highlighted the changing nature of political communication. While Bezos represented the old model of corporate-driven discourse, insider knowledge, polished talking points, and a media empire built on profits, Roumie represented something new, an authentic personal narrative. a direct emotional connection and specific policy expertise based on lived experience. Media analysts began discussing the segment as a potential turning point in how political figures communicated with the public. The days of smooth-talking corporate consultants dominating the conversation might be ending, replaced by voices that reflected the real struggles of ordinary people. 3 months later, Roumie was invited to deliver the keynote address at the Democratic National Convention, where he would tell the story of that little boy from St. Louis to millions of viewers, cementing his place as one of the party's rising stars. Bezos, meanwhile, quietly reduced his public appearances and began focusing more on his personal business interests. While he remained influential in tech circles, his public profile never fully recovered from those few minutes of exposure on CNN. The lasting lesson of the confrontation was simple but powerful. In American politics and business, authenticity beats credentials. Lived experience trumps insider knowledge. And sometimes the most devastating weapon in a battle isn't data or polished talking points. It's simply telling the truth about your own life. As one political scientist wrote in analyzing the exchange, Roumie didn't just win a media argument. He demonstrated that the future of American politics belongs to people who actually represent the experiences of the American people, not those who simply claim to speak for them. The little boy from St. Louis had indeed changed everything, and millions of Americans watching at home realized that maybe, just maybe, their own stories mattered more than they had ever been told. That's the power of authentic representation in politics. When someone who has actually lived the struggles that most Americans face gets a platform to tell their story, it can be more devastating to the establishment than any poll number or focus group result. Jonathan Roumie proved that night that sometimes the most qualified person in the room isn't the one with the most impressive resume. It's the one whose life has been shaped by the policies being debated. And if you want to see more stories about authentic voices challenging the corporate establishment, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Because in American politics today, the most interesting battles aren't happening between Democrats and Republicans. They're happening between the people who represent real experiences and those who just represent themselves. The revolution in American politics isn't going to be televised on the evening news. It's going to happen one authentic story at a time, told by people who've actually lived the lives they're fighting to improve. And after what we witnessed between Jeff Bezos and Jonathan Roumie, that revolution might be happening sooner than anyone expected. Thanks for watching. If you found this video powerful and thought-provoking, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another moment of authentic voices challenging the status quo. We're just getting started, and you won't want to miss the next chapter in this journey. Join the conversation, and let's keep pushing for change together. Don't forget to like and share this video with your friends to spread the message. See you in the next video.